The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as Princess Charlotte walked purposefully toward the Rose Garden, her small hands clutching a leather-bound diary that had belonged to her late great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. At 9 years old, Charlotte possessed a maturity that often surprised the palace staff, but today her young face carried a burden that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. Margaret Thornton, the head of palace security, watched from her office window as the princess made her way through the gardens. Something about Charlotte's posture troubled Margaret. In her 15 years protecting the royal family, she had learned to read the subtle signs of distress that royals were trained from birth to hide from the public eye. Charlotte's shoulders were too straight, her steps too measured, as if she was forcing herself to maintain composure. The previous evening had been particularly difficult for the young princess. She had overheard a heated conversation between her father, Prince William, and Queen Camilla that had left her confused and frightened. The words had been muffled through the heavy oak doors of the private study, but Charlotte had caught enough to understand that she was somehow at the center of a growing conflict within the family. Queen Camilla had been experiencing mounting pressure from various corners of the establishment. The British public's affection for Catherine, Princess of Wales, and her children created an uncomfortable dynamic for the new queen consort. Every public appearance, every photograph, every gesture was scrutinized and compared to the beloved Diana and, now to Catherine. The weight of always being measured against others had begun to take its toll on Camilla's patience and judgment. In her private chambers, Camilla sat before her ornate mirror, her reflection showing the strain of recent months. The crown that had once seemed like the ultimate prize now felt impossibly heavy. Her closest advisor, Lady Pemberton, had just delivered news that would push the queen consort toward a decision that would haunt her for years to come. "Your Majesty, the palace staff have been talking," Lady Pemberton said carefully, her weathered hands smoothing her dark dress. "There are concerns about Princess Charlotte's recent behavior. Some believe she may have overheard sensitive conversations about the family's private matters." Camilla's eyes hardened in the mirror. "What kind of conversations?" "Discussions about succession plans, financial arrangements, and certain historical documents that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth left in her personal collection." Princess Charlotte was seen near the vault yesterday evening when the royal librarians were cataloguing items. The queen consort turned slowly in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. Queen Elizabeth had left behind more than just jewels and property. There were private papers, personal correspondences, and documents that could reshape public understanding of the monarchy's recent history. Some of these papers directly concerned Camilla's long relationship with King Charles and the circumstances surrounding Diana's death. What exactly did the child see? Camilla's voice carried a new edge that Lady Pemberton had never heard before. "We're not entirely certain, Your Majesty." But Princess Charlotte was asking questions about a particular box of letters. Letters that date back to the 1990s. She seemed particularly interested in correspondence between Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana during the final months before the divorce. The room fell silent except for the steady ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Camilla understood immediately why this discovery posed such a significant threat. Those letters contained admissions and observations that could damage not only her reputation but also the carefully managed narrative about Charles and Diana's marriage that the palace had maintained for decades. Meanwhile, in the gardens, Princess Charlotte had found her favorite spot beneath an ancient oak tree. She opened the diary carefully, its aged pages releasing the faint scent of lavender that always reminded her of her great-grandmother. The diary entry she had been reading painted a picture of palace life that differed dramatically from the public image the family projected. Charlotte was an exceptionally bright child who had inherited her great-grandmother's sharp intellect and her grandmother Diana's intuitive understanding of people. She had begun to piece together fragments of conversations, mysterious document transfers, and the shifting dynamics between family members since Queen Elizabeth's passing. The diary entry that had captured her attention was dated just 3 months before Queen Elizabeth's death. It described concerns about ensuring the children understand their heritage and responsibilities and made specific reference to protecting them from those who would use them as pawns in larger games. The language was careful and diplomatic, but Charlotte sensed that her great-grandmother had been worried about something specific. Back in the palace, Queen Camilla had summoned Captain Harrison Wells, the head of the Royal Protection Unit. Wells was a decorated former SAS officer whose loyalty to the crown was unquestioned, but whose moral compass had been shaped by years of serving in conflict zones where the line between right and wrong was often crystal clear. "Captain Wells," Camilla began, her voice carrying the authority of her position, "I need you to handle a delicate situation involving Princess Charlotte." Wells stood at attention, his trained eyes immediately noting the tension in the queen consort's posture.
Of course, Your Majesty. What seems to be the concern?
The princess has come into possession of certain documents that contain sensitive information about the family. These materials could be misinterpreted and, potentially cause significant damage if they were to become public. I need you to retrieve these items and ensure that Princess Charlotte understands the importance of not discussing what she may have read.
Captain Wells felt an immediate unease about the request.
In his years of service, he had protected the royal family from external threats, but this was the first time he was being asked to take action against a member of the family itself.
Ma'am, could you provide more specific details about the nature of these documents and the potential threat they pose? Camilla's eyes flashed with irritation.
Captain Wells, I am not in the habit of explaining myself to my security personnel. The documents in question relate to private family matters that a 9-year-old child cannot possibly understand in their proper context. If these materials were to be misconstrued or shared inappropriately, they could cause irreparable harm to the monarchy. The captain's military training had taught him to follow orders without question, but his experience had also taught him to recognize when a situation required careful consideration.
Your Majesty, what specific actions would you like me to take regarding Princess Charlotte?
I want you to detain her until we can retrieve the documents and assess exactly what she has learned.
This is a matter of national security, Captain Wells.
The stability of the crown itself may be at stake. The word detain hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Captain Wells felt his world shift slightly as he processed what was being asked of him. In his military career, he had detained enemy combatants, suspected terrorists, and various threats to national security. Never had he been asked to detain a child, let alone a member of the royal family he had sworn to protect. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I want to ensure I understand your instructions correctly.
You are asking me to physically restrain Princess Charlotte, a 9-year-old member of the royal family, in order to retrieve documents she may have in her possession?"
Camilla's expression hardened further. "I am asking you to do whatever is necessary to protect the crown from a potentially devastating security breach. Princess Charlotte is a child who has stumbled upon information that could be weaponized against the monarchy by our enemies. Sometimes, Captain Wells, protecting someone requires making difficult decisions that they may not understand at the time." The captain's mind raced through his training, his oath of service, and his personal moral code. He had spent his career protecting the innocent and serving the greater good. The woman before him was asking him to treat a child as a threat to national security, but his instincts told him that the real threat might be something else entirely. "Your Majesty, before I proceed with any action, I need to ask a question that I believe is crucial to understanding the situation properly."
Camilla's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Captain Wells, this is not a discussion. This is a direct order from your queen." "I understand that, Your Majesty.
But, with all due respect, I have a responsibility to ensure that any actions I take are lawful and proportionate to the actual threat posed. My question is this: are you absolutely certain you want me to detain a child who carries the blood of kings, and if so, can you provide me with the legal authority under which I would be operating?"
The room fell into complete silence.
Lady Pemberton's face had gone pale, and even the clock seemed to have stopped ticking. Camilla stared at Captain Wells with a mixture of shock and rage that he had dared to question her authority.
"Captain Wells," she said slowly, "are you refusing to follow a direct order?"
"No, Your Majesty. I am asking for clarification about the legal and moral foundation for that order. In my oath of service, I swore to protect all members of the royal family, including Princess Charlotte. I also swore to uphold the law and serve the crown with honor. Before I take any action that might conflict with those oaths, I need to understand exactly what authority I am operating under and what specific threat justifies the detention of a 9-year-old princess." The captain's question had exposed a fundamental problem with Camilla's request. There was no legal authority that would allow for the detention of Princess Charlotte without cause, and no legitimate security threat that would justify such extreme measures. What Camilla was asking for was not the protection of national security, but the suppression of potentially embarrassing historical information. Outside, Princess Charlotte continued reading her great-grandmother's diary, unaware that her innocent curiosity had triggered a crisis that would test the very foundations of modern royal protocol and force everyone involved to confront the difference between serving the crown and serving those who wear it. The question that Captain Wells had asked would soon echo through the corridors of power, forcing everyone from palace staff to government ministers to examine the limits of royal authority and the rights of even the youngest members of the royal family.
Some questions, once asked, cannot be unasked, and some truths, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen.
As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything the royal family thought they understood about power, loyalty, and the price of keeping secrets. The silence in Queen Camilla's private chambers stretched for what felt like an eternity after Captain Wells posed his question. Lady Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her years of palace protocol training having never prepared her for a moment when a member of the security staff would directly challenge the Queen Consort's authority. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to highlight the growing tension in the room as Camilla struggled to formulate a response that would maintain her authority while addressing the captain's legitimate concerns. Captain Wells remained standing at attention, but his mind was working through the implications of what he had just witnessed. In his military career, he had encountered commanders who allowed personal interests to cloud their judgment, and he had learned to recognize the warning signs. The Queen Consort's reluctance to provide specific details about the supposed security threat, combined with her insistence on treating Princess Charlotte as a hostile entity, suggested that this situation was more about controlling information than protecting national security. "Captain Wells," Camilla finally said, her voice carrying a forced calmness that did not quite mask her underlying frustration, "you seem to be under the impression that my authority as Queen Consort is subject to your personal approval. I am ordering you to secure Princess Charlotte and retrieve any documents she may have taken from restricted areas of the palace." The captain's expression remained neutral, but those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle signs of his growing concern.
"Your Majesty, I understand the importance of protecting sensitive information.
However, my oath requires me to protect all members of the royal family, and that includes protecting them from actions that might not be in their best interests. If Princess Charlotte has indeed accessed restricted documents, there are established protocols for handling such situations that do not involve detention." Camilla rose from her chair, her movement sharp and deliberate.
"Protocols? Captain Wells, I am rewriting the protocols. The situation we are dealing with is unprecedented and requires unprecedented measures. That child has potentially compromised decades of carefully managed royal communications, and you are concerned about following routine procedures?" Lady Pemberton finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Your Majesty, perhaps Captain Wells could simply speak with Princess Charlotte and assess what she has actually learned before we consider more decisive actions." Both Camilla and Captain Wells turned toward the elderly advisor, who immediately regretted speaking. The Queen Consort's eyes had taken on a quality that Lady Pemberton had never seen before, a cold calculation that suggested she was willing to go much further than anyone had anticipated to protect her position. "Lady Pemberton, Princess Charlotte is not merely a curious child who has wandered into the wrong room. She has accessed private correspondence between Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana that could fundamentally alter public perception of this family's history. The contents of those letters include discussions about Charles's fitness for the throne, concerns about my influence on his decisions, and detailed accounts of Diana's final months that contradict the official narrative we have maintained for nearly 3 decades. Captain Wells felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. This was not about national security or protecting the monarchy from external threats. This was about suppressing historical information that could damage Camilla's reputation and potentially call into question her legitimacy as Queen Consort. The documents Princess Charlotte had discovered were apparently so damaging that Camilla was willing to treat a 9-year-old child as an enemy of the state. "Your Majesty," the captain said carefully, "if the concern is about historical documents and their potential impact on public perception, surely there are legal and appropriate ways to address the situation. Princess Charlotte is a member of the royal family, not a security threat. Any action taken against her would need to be justifiable under law and consistent with our duty to protect her welfare." Camilla's patience finally snapped completely. "Captain Wells, you are either with this family or against it. Princess Charlotte's welfare is exactly what I am trying to protect. If these documents become public, the resulting scandal would destroy her father's reign before it truly begins. The child cannot possibly understand the consequences of what she has stumbled upon, and it is our responsibility to ensure that her innocent curiosity does not bring down the monarchy." The captain remained silent for a moment, processing the full implications of what he was being asked to do. In his military career, he had faced numerous situations where following orders conflicted with his personal moral code, but this was perhaps the most challenging.
He was being asked to treat a child as a threat to national security, not because she posed any actual danger, but because she had accidentally discovered information that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Meanwhile, in the Rose Garden, Princess Charlotte had closed her great-grandmother's diary and was walking slowly toward the palace's main entrance. The entry she had read painted a picture of a family struggling with impossible pressures and competing loyalties. Queen Elizabeth's words revealed a woman who loved her family deeply but was also deeply concerned about the choices some of them were making. One particular passage had struck Charlotte with unusual force. Queen Elizabeth had written about the importance of truth and integrity in public service, noting that those who wear the crown must remember that they serve something greater than themselves. The late Queen had expressed concern about family members who seemed to have forgotten this fundamental principle, though she was careful not to name specific individuals. As Charlotte approached the palace, she noticed an unusual level of activity among the security staff. Guards who typically maintained discreet positions were moving with purpose, and she could see Captain Wells through one of the ground floor windows, apparently in deep conversation with someone she could not see clearly. Her intuition, sharpened by months of observing adult conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms, told her that something significant was happening. Back in Camilla's chambers, the confrontation between the Queen Consort and Captain Wells had reached a critical point. The captain's refusal to immediately comply with her orders had forced Camilla to reveal more about her motivations than she had intended, and she now found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to justify actions that she knew crossed established ethical and legal boundaries. "Captain Wells," she said, making one final attempt to assert her authority, "I am giving you a direct order to detain Princess Charlotte until we can assess the full extent of her knowledge about these sensitive documents. Your role is not to question the wisdom of my decisions but to implement them efficiently and discreetly." The captain took a deep breath before responding. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, my role is to protect the royal family, uphold the law, and serve the crown with honor. What you are asking me to do conflicts with all three of those responsibilities. I cannot and will not detain Princess Charlotte without proper legal authority and without evidence that she poses a genuine threat to security." Camilla's face flushed with anger and something approaching panic. "Are you telling me that you refuse to follow my orders?" "I am telling you that I cannot follow orders that are illegal, unethical, and harmful to a member of the royal family I am sworn to protect. If you believe that Princess Charlotte has accessed sensitive information inappropriately, there are proper channels for addressing that situation. Those channels do not include treating a 9-year-old child as a prisoner." Lady Pemberton watched this exchange with growing alarm. In her decades of service to the royal family, she had never witnessed such a direct challenge to royal authority, nor had she ever seen a member of the royal family make such questionable decisions under pressure. The situation was spiraling far beyond anything that could be managed through normal palace protocols. "Your Majesty," Lady Pemberton said hesitantly, "perhaps Captain Wells is correct that we should consider alternative approaches. If Princess Charlotte has indeed read sensitive materials, we might address the situation through her parents rather than through security measures." Camilla turned on her advisor with barely contained fury. "Her parents? Do you think Prince William is going to help us suppress information that makes his stepmother look like a manipulative influence on his father? Do you think Catherine is going to support efforts to keep Diana's private thoughts about this family hidden from the world? Lady Pemberton, sometimes I wonder if you understand the realities of the situation we are facing." Captain Wells realized that the Queen Consort's perspective had become so distorted by fear and paranoia that she was no longer capable of making rational decisions about how to handle the situation. Her willingness to treat Princess Charlotte as an enemy revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of her role and responsibilities as a member of the royal family. "Your Majesty," he said firmly, "I need you to understand something very clearly. Princess Charlotte is not your enemy. She is a 9-year-old child who has accidentally discovered some historical documents. The appropriate response is not to detain her but to speak with her parents about how to address her questions in an age-appropriate manner. Any other approach will create far more problems than it solves." Camilla stared at him with an expression that combined rage, desperation, and something approaching genuine fear. "Captain Wells, you clearly do not understand the stakes involved here. Those documents contain information that could destroy this monarchy. They include Queen Elizabeth's private doubts about Charles's judgment, her concerns about my influence on royal decision-making, and detailed accounts of Diana's final conversations with her mother-in-law. If this information becomes public, it will not matter whether Princess Charlotte is 9 years old or 90 years old. The damage will be irreversible. The captain finally understood the full scope of what Camilla was trying to protect. The documents Princess Charlotte had discovered apparently contained not just embarrassing historical information, but potentially explosive revelations about the royal family's private dynamics during some of its most challenging periods. However, this revelation only strengthened his conviction that the situation needed to be handled through proper channels rather than through the detention of a child. Your Majesty, regardless of the sensitivity of these documents, the solution is not to treat Princess Charlotte as a criminal. If the information is as damaging as you suggest, then it is even more important that we handle the situation in a way that preserves the integrity and moral authority of the crown. Detaining a child to suppress historical information would be far more damaging to the monarchy than anything contained in Queen Elizabeth's private papers. Camilla fell silent, her mind racing through the implications of what Captain Wells was saying. She was beginning to realize that her panic had led her to propose actions that were not only illegal and unethical but also strategically counterproductive. The detention of Princess Charlotte would create exactly the kind of scandal she was trying to avoid, while doing nothing to address the underlying problem of the sensitive documents. Lady Pemberton sensed an opportunity to redirect the conversation toward more reasonable solutions. Your Majesty, perhaps we should consider consulting with the palace legal team about how to properly handle the situation. They would be better positioned to advise us on appropriate protocols for managing sensitive historical documents and addressing any concerns about unauthorized access. For the first time since the conversation began, Camilla seemed to consider the possibility that there might be alternatives to her original plan. However, her fundamental concern about the potential damage from the documents remained unchanged, and she was still searching for a way to maintain control over the situation. Outside, Princess Charlotte had entered the palace and was making her way toward the family's private quarters, unaware that her innocent curiosity about her great-grandmother's papers had triggered a crisis that was testing the moral foundations of the institution she would one day help lead. The question that Captain Wells had posed was reverberating through the corridors of power, forcing everyone involved to confront fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority and the limits of what could be justified in the name of protecting the crown. The morning had progressed with an almost surreal quality as news of the confrontation between Queen Camilla and Captain Wells began to spread through the highest levels of palace staff. Word traveled in whispers through the network of trusted advisors, private secretaries, and senior household members who formed the invisible backbone of royal operations. Each person who heard the story struggled to comprehend that such a fundamental breakdown in protocol and judgment was occurring at the heart of the monarchy. Sir Anthony Weatherby, the private secretary to the king, was in his office reviewing the day's schedule when Lady Pemberton's assistant knocked urgently on his door. The young man's face was pale with the kind of anxiety that comes from witnessing events that threaten to reshape one's understanding of institutional stability. Sir Anthony, the assistant began, his voice barely above a whisper, Lady Pemberton has asked me to inform you that there is an urgent situation developing that requires immediate attention. It involves Her Majesty the Queen Consort, Princess Charlotte, and Captain Wells. Sir Anthony had spent 35 years navigating palace politics and crisis management, but the combination of these three names in the context of an urgent situation sent an immediate chill down his spine. What exactly has happened? The assistant glanced around nervously before stepping into the office and closing the door behind him. Sir, it appears that Queen Camilla has ordered Captain Wells to detain Princess Charlotte in order to retrieve certain documents that the princess may have accessed from Queen Elizabeth's private collection. Captain Wells has refused to comply with the order and has questioned the Queen Consort's authority to issue such instructions. Sir Anthony felt the ground shift beneath him as he processed this information. In 3.5 decades of royal service, he had managed scandals involving affairs, financial improprieties, public relations disasters, and various family conflicts, but he had never encountered a situation where a member of the royal family had attempted to have another family member detained by security forces. Are you absolutely certain about these details? Sir Anthony asked, though he could see from the young man's expression that the information was accurate. Yes, sir. Lady Pemberton was present during the entire conversation and has asked me to brief you immediately while she attempts to resolve the situation diplomatically. Sir Anthony's mind immediately began working through the legal, ethical, and practical implications of what he had just learned. The detention of Princess Charlotte would not only be illegal without proper cause, but it would also create a constitutional crisis that could fundamentally damage the monarchy's relationship with both Parliament and the British public. More importantly, it would represent a violation of the basic principles that were supposed to govern royal behavior. Where is His Majesty the King at present? Sir Anthony asked. His Majesty is in meetings with the Commonwealth Secretary about trade agreements. He is not scheduled to be available until this afternoon. Sir Anthony realized that the crisis was unfolding without King Charles's knowledge or input, which meant that decisions were being made by Queen Camilla that could have far-reaching consequences for his reign. The private secretary understood that he was facing one of those moments that would define his legacy and, potentially, the future of the institution he had devoted his life to serving. Meanwhile, in a different wing of the palace, Prince William had received an unexpected call from his security detail informing him that there was unusual activity around Princess Charlotte's location. The language was carefully neutral, but William's experience with palace communications told him that something significant was happening that involved his daughter. William ended his morning meeting with environmental policy advisors and immediately made his way toward the family quarters, his mind racing through possible explanations for the security alert. Catherine was attending a charity event in London, which meant that Charlotte was supposed to be supervised by her governess during her private study time. As William walked through the corridors toward his daughter's location, he encountered Captain Wells, who was clearly moving with purpose toward the same destination. The expression on the captain's face suggested that whatever was happening was serious enough to require immediate intervention. "Captain Wells," William called out, "I understand there may be some concern about Charlotte's activities this morning." The captain paused, his training and instincts warring with the unprecedented nature of the situation he was facing. "Your Royal Highness, there has been a development that I believe requires your immediate attention. Queen Camilla has expressed concerns about Princess Charlotte's access to certain historical documents, and she has requested that I take actions that I believe would not be in the princess's best interests." William felt his protective instincts immediately activate. What kind of actions? Captain Wells chose his words carefully, aware that he was crossing into territory that could end his career but believing that his duty to protect the royal family required complete honesty. "Your Royal Highness, Queen Camilla has ordered me to detain Princess Charlotte until certain documents can be retrieved and until the extent of her knowledge about their contents can be assessed. I have refused to comply with this order because I believe it is inappropriate and potentially illegal." The words hit William with the force of a physical blow. The idea that his stepmother would attempt to have his 9-year-old daughter detained was so far outside the bounds of reasonable behavior that he initially struggled to process the information. However, his understanding of Camilla's increasing paranoia about public perception and her growing desperation to control the family's narrative made the scenario grimly plausible. "Where is Charlotte now?" William asked, his voice taking on an edge that Captain Wells had never heard before. "She was last seen entering the palace from the Rose Garden, Your Royal Highness. I believe she is heading toward the family quarters, but I wanted to speak with you before taking any action regarding Queen Camilla's instructions." William's mind immediately shifted into protective mode. "Captain Wells, I want you to ensure that no member of the security staff takes any action regarding my daughter without my explicit permission." "Is that understood?" "Completely understood, Your Royal Highness. I should also inform you that the situation has been reported to Sir Anthony Weatherby, and there are concerns that Queen Camilla's request may have legal and constitutional implications that extend beyond family dynamics." As they spoke, Princess Charlotte appeared at the end of the corridor, walking slowly while reading something in her hands. She looked up when she heard voices and smiled when she saw her father, apparently unaware that she had become the center of a crisis that was shaking the foundations of palace protocol. "Papa!" Charlotte called out, her voice carrying the natural joy of a child seeing her parent unexpectedly. "I've been reading Great-Granny's diary, and there are some things I wanted to ask you about." William felt his heart clench as he realized that his daughter's innocent curiosity had somehow triggered a response from Camilla that bordered on the irrational. He walked toward Charlotte with Captain Wells following at a discreet distance, his mind working through how to protect his daughter from a situation she could not possibly understand. "What have you been reading, sweetheart?" William asked gently, kneeling down to Charlotte's level when she reached them. Charlotte held up the leather-bound diary with obvious pride. "Great-Granny wrote about lots of interesting things, Papa. She wrote about you and Mama, and about Uncle Harry, and about Queen Camilla too. Some of the things she wrote were confusing, though. She seemed worried about something, but she didn't say exactly what." William took the diary carefully, his eyes scanning the pages that Charlotte had been reading. Even a quick glance revealed why Camilla might be concerned about the contents. Queen Elizabeth's private thoughts about the family dynamics during the final years of her reign were far more critical and specific than anything she had ever said publicly. "Charlotte," William said softly, "these are very private thoughts that Great-Granny wrote for herself. Sometimes when people write in diaries, they express concerns or feelings that might not make sense to other people who weren't there when those feelings were important. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully, her mature intelligence evident in her response.
I understand that, Papa.
But some of the things great-granny wrote about seem important. She wrote about making sure that the family always remembers who they serve and why. She seemed worried that some people might forget that being royal means helping other people, not just having power. Captain Wells listened to this exchange with growing respect for both Princess Charlotte's understanding and Prince William's handling of the situation. The child clearly possessed an intuitive grasp of the fundamental principles that were supposed to guide royal behavior, principles that seemed to have been forgotten by Queen Camilla in her panic about protecting her own position.
Your Royal Highness, Captain Wells said quietly, I believe you should know that this situation has created significant concern among senior staff about appropriate protocols for handling sensitive family materials. Sir Anthony Weatherby has been briefed and may wish to discuss the matter with you. William understood immediately that the crisis extended far beyond a simple disagreement about access to historical documents. Captain Wells's refusal to follow Camilla's orders had exposed fundamental questions about the limits of royal authority and the proper channels for addressing family conflicts that had security implications. Captain Wells, I want you to prepare a complete report about Queen Camilla's request and your response to it. This report should include specific details about the orders you were given and the reasons why you believe those orders were inappropriate. I will be discussing this matter with both Sir Anthony and with my father. Charlotte looked between her father and Captain Wells with the keen perception that had made Queen Elizabeth believe she would one day be an exceptional leader. Papa, is Queen Camilla angry about something I did?
I didn't mean to cause any trouble by reading Great-Granny's diary. William's heart ached at his daughter's innocent question and her immediate assumption that she had somehow done something wrong.
Charlotte, you haven't done anything wrong.
Sometimes adults make mistakes when they're worried or scared, and it's important for other adults to help them remember the right way to handle difficult situations. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Anthony Weatherby, whose normally calm demeanor showed signs of the stress he was experiencing in trying to manage an unprecedented crisis. Your Royal Highness, I apologize for the interruption, but there are urgent matters that require your attention. William stood, keeping one hand on Charlotte's shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and reassuring.
Sir Anthony, I believe I understand the nature of the urgent matters. Captain Wells has briefed me on Queen Camilla's unusual requests regarding my daughter.
Sir Anthony glanced at Princess Charlotte and chose his words carefully. Your Royal Highness, there are constitutional and legal implications to the morning's events that extend beyond family dynamics. I believe we need to address these matters in a way that protects both the integrity of the institution and the welfare of all family members involved. Charlotte looked up at the serious expressions on all the adult faces around her and made a decision that reflected wisdom beyond her years.
Papa, would it help if I gave Great-Granny's diary to you?
I finished reading the parts that interested me, and maybe it would be better if a grown-up took care of it now. William accepted the diary from his daughter, understanding that she was offering a solution that demonstrated both maturity and a grasp of the underlying tensions that had created the crisis.
Thank you, Charlotte. That's very thoughtful of you.
As the group stood in the corridor of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by centuries of royal history and tradition, they were all aware that they were participating in a moment that would have far-reaching consequences for the monarchy's future. Captain Wells's question about the appropriateness of detaining a royal child had forced everyone involved to confront fundamental questions about power, responsibility, and the principles that should guide those who serve the crown. The morning's events had revealed that the greatest threat to the monarchy might not come from external enemies or public criticism, but from the willingness of those within the institution to abandon its core values in pursuit of protecting their personal interests. Princess Charlotte's innocent curiosity had inadvertently created a test of character that some had passed and others had failed spectacularly. The afternoon brought an emergency meeting in the palace's most secure conference room, a space typically reserved for discussions of matters affecting national security and constitutional significance. The ornate chamber, with its portraits of monarchs stretching back centuries, had witnessed deliberations about wars, succession crises, and constitutional reforms, but rarely had it hosted a meeting to address a member of the royal family's attempt to have another family member detained. King Charles entered the room with the heavy step of a man who had spent the morning learning that his wife had created a crisis that threatened to undermine everything he had worked to achieve since becoming monarch. Sir Anthony Weatherby had briefed him thoroughly about the morning's events, but the king still struggled to comprehend how Camilla's fears about historical documents had led her to such extreme measures. Present in the room were Prince William, Sir Anthony Weatherby, Captain Wells, the palace's chief legal counsel Margaret Harrison QC, and the head of parliamentary liaison Sir Robert Sterling. Notably absent was Queen Camilla, who had been advised that her presence might be counterproductive given her central role in creating the crisis they were gathered to address. "Gentlemen," Ms. Harrison, King Charles began, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and deep concern, "we are here to discuss events that represent perhaps the most serious internal crisis this monarchy has faced in my lifetime. I want each of you to speak freely about your understanding of the situation and your recommendations for how we should proceed." Sir Anthony opened the discussion with a comprehensive summary of the morning's events, carefully maintaining the neutral tone that had served him well through decades of palace crises. However, even his diplomatic language could not disguise the severity of what had occurred. "Your Majesty, the fundamental issue we face is that Queen Camilla issued an order that was both illegal and contrary to the basic principles that govern our institution. Captain Wells's refusal to comply with that order has protected both Princess Charlotte and the integrity of the monarchy, but it has also created a constitutional situation that requires careful resolution." Captain Wells, still in his formal uniform but now bearing the psychological weight of having challenged royal authority, provided his account of the confrontation with stark military precision. "Your Majesty, Queen Camilla specifically ordered me to detain Princess Charlotte until certain documents could be retrieved and until the extent of her knowledge about their contents could be assessed. When I asked for clarification about the legal authority for such action, Queen Camilla became increasingly agitated and accused me of refusing to follow orders." King Charles listened to this account with visible distress, understanding that his wife's actions had put Captain Wells in an impossible position and created exactly the kind of scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation for generations. Prince William spoke next, his voice controlled but carrying an undercurrent of anger that everyone in the room could detect. "Father, I need you to understand that what happened this morning was not simply a case of miscommunication or excessive caution. Camilla attempted to have my 9-year-old daughter treated as a security threat because Charlotte had read some of grandmother's private thoughts about the family. The level of paranoia and poor judgment that this represents is deeply concerning." Margaret Harrison QC, the chief legal counsel, addressed the constitutional implications with the precision that had made her one of the most respected legal minds in Britain. "Your Majesty, from a strictly legal perspective, Queen Camilla had no authority to order the detention of Princess Charlotte or any other member of the royal family. Such an action would require either a court order based on evidence of criminal activity or invocation of extraordinary security powers that simply do not apply to this situation. Had Captain Wells complied with the order, both he and Queen Camilla could potentially have faced criminal charges." The weight of this legal assessment settled over the room like a heavy fog. King Charles realized that his wife had not simply made an error in judgment but had potentially committed acts that could have resulted in criminal prosecution. Sir Robert Sterling, whose role required him to consider the political implications of royal actions, spoke with the gravity of someone who understood how quickly constitutional crises could spiral beyond the palace's ability to control them. "Your Majesty, if news of this morning's events were to become public, the political ramifications could be devastating. The idea that Queen Camilla attempted to have Princess Charlotte detained would raise fundamental questions about her fitness for her role and could potentially trigger parliamentary inquiries into the royal family's internal governance." King Charles understood immediately that the crisis extended far beyond family dynamics and into the realm of his own legitimacy as monarch. If Camilla's actions became public knowledge, they would overshadow every positive achievement of his reign and potentially accelerate Republican sentiment that was already growing in some quarters. "Captain Wells," the king said directly, "I want you to understand that your refusal to follow Queen Camilla's order was not only correct but essential for protecting both my daughter and the institution we all serve. Your actions this morning demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage that we should expect from those who protect the royal family." Captain Wells stood slightly straighter at this acknowledgement, but his expression remained serious. "Your Majesty, I believe it's important for you to know that this situation has raised concerns among other members of the protection staff about the clarity of our authority and the protocols for handling situations where family members issue conflicting instructions or inappropriate orders." Sir Anthony recognized this as a crucial point that needed to be addressed immediately. "Your Majesty, Captain Wells raises an important issue about command structure and protocols. We need to establish clear guidelines about the authority of different family members to issue security-related instructions and the procedures for handling situations where such instructions might be inappropriate or illegal." King Charles nodded, understanding that one of the long-term consequences of this crisis would be the need to formalize protocols that had previously been managed through informal understanding and mutual respect.
Sir Anthony, I want you to work with MS.
Harrison to develop comprehensive guidelines that clarify these matters and ensure that no member of our security staff is ever again put in the position that Captain Wells faced this morning. Prince William leaned forward, his concern for his daughter evident in his posture and expression. Father, I also need to address the fact that Charlotte has been exposed to this adult conflict in a way that could be confusing and potentially harmful for her. She's already asking questions about why Queen Camilla might be angry with her, and I'm concerned about the psychological impact of being treated as a threat by a family member. The king's expression softened as he considered his granddaughter's perspective on the morning's events.
William, how do you believe we should address Charlotte's questions about what happened? I think we need to be honest with her in an age-appropriate way.
Charlotte is exceptionally bright and perceptive, and she's already sensed that something unusual happened this morning. If we try to pretend that nothing occurred, she'll lose trust in our honesty. If we explain that sometimes adults make mistakes when they're worried or scared, and that other adults have a responsibility to correct those mistakes, I think she'll understand. Margaret Harrison QC raised an additional concern that had been weighing on her mind throughout the discussion. Your Majesty, we also need to consider what to do about the documents that Princess Charlotte was reading.
Queen Camilla's extreme reaction suggests that they contain information that she believes could be damaging if made public.
However, our response to those concerns needs to be proportionate and legal. Sir Anthony had anticipated this question and had already begun developing recommendations. Your Majesty, I suggest that we conduct a thorough but appropriate review of Queen Elizabeth's private papers to assess their contents and determine proper protocols for their preservation and access. This review should be conducted by palace archivists and legal counsel, not by security personnel, and should be guided by historical preservation standards rather than by concerns about potential embarrassment. King Charles understood that his mother's private papers represented a complex challenge that required careful balance between historical preservation and family privacy. However, he also understood that Camilla's reaction to Charlotte's discovery had created a situation where the contents of those papers might eventually become public regardless of the family's preferences.
Sir Anthony, I want you to coordinate this review with appropriate legal oversight and historical expertise.
The goal should be to ensure that these documents are preserved appropriately and that access to them is managed according to established archival standards, not according to fears about potential public relations implications. The conversation was interrupted by a quiet knock on the door, followed by the entry of Lady Pemberton, who looked as though she had aged several years since the morning's events. Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but Queen Camilla has asked me to convey her request for a private audience to discuss the morning's events. King Charles exchanged glances with the other people in the room before responding. Lady Pemberton, please inform Queen Camilla that I will meet with her privately after this meeting concludes. However, I want her to understand that this conversation will address fundamental questions about her judgment and her understanding of appropriate behavior for a member of the royal family. After Lady Pemberton departed, Sir Robert Stirling raised a final concern that had been troubling him throughout the discussion. Your Majesty, we should also consider whether Queen Camilla's actions this morning indicate broader issues with her decision-making that could affect other aspects of her role. The willingness to treat a child as a security threat suggests a level of paranoia and poor judgment that could manifest in other situations. King Charles felt the weight of this observation, understanding that his wife's actions had raised questions about her fitness for the responsibilities that came with her position. The morning's events had revealed aspects of Camilla's character that troubled him deeply and that could not be easily dismissed as momentary lapses in judgment. Sir Robert, that is exactly the kind of broader question that I need to address in my private conversation with Queen Camilla. This morning's events cannot be viewed as an isolated incident but must be understood as potentially indicative of fundamental problems with her approach to her role and responsibilities. As the meeting drew toward a close, Captain Wells requested permission to speak once more. Your Majesty, I want you to know that my colleagues and I remain completely committed to protecting every member of the royal family, including Queen Camilla. However, the events of this morning have made it clear that we need better guidance about how to handle situations where protecting one family member might require refusing orders from another family member. King Charles recognized the wisdom in this request and the importance of ensuring that his security staff had clear protocols for managing the complex dynamics that could arise within any family, even a royal one. Captain Wells, you and your colleagues have my complete confidence and support. The guidelines that Sir Anthony and Ms. Harrison develop will ensure that you have clear authority to prioritize the welfare and legal rights of all family members, regardless of who might be issuing instructions that conflict with those priorities. As the formal meeting concluded, King Charles remained in the conference room, contemplating the private conversation with his wife that would determine whether their marriage could survive the crisis she had created and whether she could continue to serve as queen consort. The question that Captain Wells had asked that morning had exposed fundamental problems that extended far beyond the immediate situation, and the king understood that the decisions he made in the coming hours would shape both his reign and his family's future in ways that would reverberate for generations. The private meeting between King Charles and Queen Camilla took place in the king's personal study, a room lined with first-edition books and family photographs that had witnessed countless intimate conversations throughout the decades of their relationship. The late afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the Persian rug, creating an atmosphere that felt both familiar and charged with unprecedented tension. Camilla entered the room with the bearing of someone who understood that her entire future hung in the balance of the conversation that was about to unfold. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by a vulnerability that Charles had rarely seen during their long relationship, and her hands trembled slightly as she took the seat across from his desk. "Charles," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I know that today's events have created a situation that neither of us anticipated. I want you to understand that everything I did was motivated by my desire to protect this family and this institution." King Charles studied his wife's face carefully, searching for signs of the woman he had fallen in love with decades earlier and trying to reconcile that memory with the person who had attempted to have his granddaughter detained. "Camilla, I need you to help me understand how you believe that ordering the detention of a 9-year-old child could possibly protect our family or this institution." The question hung in the air between them, and Camilla's composure began to crack as she struggled to formulate an explanation that could justify her actions. "Charles, you don't understand the magnitude of what Charlotte discovered. Those documents contain information that could destroy everything we've worked to build. They include your mother's private doubts about your readiness for the throne, her concerns about my influence on your decisions, and detailed accounts of Diana's final conversations that contradict the narrative we've maintained for nearly 3 decades. King Charles felt his stomach tighten as he absorbed the full implications of what Camilla was revealing. His mother's private papers apparently contained assessments of his character and judgment that were far more critical than anything she had ever expressed directly to him. However, this revelation only strengthened his conviction that Camilla's response had been completely inappropriate. "Camilla, even if those documents contain the most damaging possible assessments of our family, that does not justify treating Charlotte as a security threat. She is a 9-year-old child who was reading her great-grandmother's diary out of innocent curiosity. The appropriate response would have been to speak with William and Catherine about managing the situation, not to order her detention." Camilla's eyes flashed with the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. "Charles, you're being naive about the realities we face. If those documents become public, they will be used by our enemies to undermine your entire reign. The press will seize on every critical comment your mother made about us, and the Republican movement will use them as evidence that even Queen Elizabeth had doubts about the monarchy's future." The king recognized that Camilla's fears about the potential impact of the documents might not be entirely unfounded, but her willingness to sacrifice fundamental principles and family relationships to address those fears revealed a character deficiency that he could no longer ignore. "Camilla, I understand your concerns about the potential consequences of public disclosure. However, your response revealed a willingness to abandon every principle that is supposed to guide our behavior as members of the royal family." As they spoke, the broader implications of the morning's crisis were being felt throughout the palace and beyond. Sir Anthony Weatherby was coordinating with legal counsel to develop new protocols that would prevent similar situations from arising in the future. Captain Wells was briefing his colleagues about the clear lines of authority that would govern their actions when family members issued conflicting instructions. Most importantly, Prince William was having a careful conversation with Princess Charlotte about the morning's events that would help her understand the complex dynamics of adult responsibility and moral courage. In the king's study, Camilla made one final attempt to justify her actions by appealing to Charles's own insecurities about his legitimacy as monarch. "Charles, your mother's papers include specific passages where she questions whether you have the strength of character necessary for effective leadership. If the public reads those assessments, combined with her concerns about my influence on your decision-making, it could fundamentally undermine your authority as king." King Charles felt the sting of this revelation about his mother's private doubts, but he also understood that Camilla's willingness to use this information as justification for her behavior revealed the depth of her moral confusion. "Camilla, the solution to concerns about my character is not to behave in ways that confirm those concerns. Your actions this morning demonstrated exactly the kind of poor judgment and disregard for fundamental principles that would justify any doubts about our fitness for leadership. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Camilla gradually recognizing that her husband was not going to accept her justifications for the morning's events. She began to understand that the crisis she had created had fundamentally altered Charles's perception of her character and her suitability for the role of queen consort. "Charles," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "what happens now?" The king's response came with the weight of both personal pain and institutional responsibility. "Camilla, you will need to take an extended period of private reflection to consider whether you are prepared to fulfill the responsibilities of your role according to the principles that should govern all members of this family. During this period, you will not participate in public engagements or official royal duties." The implications of this decision were immediately clear to both of them. Camilla was being suspended from her role as queen consort pending a comprehensive assessment of her fitness to continue in that position. The woman who had fought for decades to claim her place at the center of the British monarchy was now facing the possibility that her own actions had disqualified her from the role she had sought so desperately. "Charles," Camilla said, tears beginning to form in her eyes, "are you saying that our marriage is over?" The king's expression softened slightly as he considered the personal dimensions of the institutional crisis they were facing. "Camilla, our marriage will survive if you can demonstrate that you understand why your actions were wrong and if you can convince me that such poor judgment will never be repeated. However, your role as queen consort depends on your ability to embody the values that this institution represents, and today's events have raised serious questions about whether you can meet that standard." As evening approached, the palace staff worked to manage the immediate aftermath of the crisis while developing long-term strategies for preventing similar situations. The protocols that Sir Anthony Weatherby and Margaret Harrison QC were developing would ensure that security personnel had clear authority to prioritize the welfare of all family members and clear procedures for handling inappropriate instructions from any source. Captain Wells submitted his formal report about the morning's events, a document that would become part of the historical record of how the monarchy addressed one of its most serious internal crises. His willingness to question Queen Camilla's authority had protected both Princess Charlotte and the institutional integrity that the royal family was supposed to represent. Princess Charlotte, meanwhile, was enjoying dinner with her parents and siblings, apparently unaware that her innocent curiosity about her great-grandmother's diary had triggered a constitutional crisis that would reshape royal protocols for generations to come. Prince William and Catherine had explained to her that sometimes adults make mistakes when they are worried or scared, and that other adults have a responsibility to correct those mistakes and protect everyone involved. "Papa," Charlotte asked as they finished dinner, "will Queen Camilla be sad that she made a mistake?" William considered his response carefully, wanting to teach his daughter about accountability while maintaining appropriate compassion. "Charlotte, when people make serious mistakes, they often feel sad and worried about the consequences. But the most important thing is that they learn from their mistakes and work to make better decisions in the future." Charlotte nodded with the wisdom that had impressed Queen Elizabeth and that suggested she would indeed become an exceptional leader when her time came. Great-Granny wrote in her diary that being royal means always trying to help people and do the right thing, even when it's difficult. I think Queen Camilla forgot that for a little while. The simplicity and accuracy of Charlotte's assessment captured the essence of what had gone wrong that morning and what would be required for the royal family to move forward from the crisis. Queen Camilla had indeed forgotten that being royal meant serving others rather than protecting oneself, and her willingness to treat a child as an enemy had revealed fundamental problems with her understanding of royal responsibility. In the weeks that followed, Queen Camilla would undergo an extended period of private reflection, working with counselors and advisors to understand how her fears and insecurities had led her to abandon the principles that should have guided her behavior. Whether she would be able to demonstrate sufficient growth and understanding to resume her role as queen consort remained an open question that would determine both her personal future and the future stability of King Charles's reign. Captain Wells received formal recognition for his moral courage in refusing to follow illegal orders, and his actions became part of the training curriculum for all palace security personnel. The protocols developed in response to the crisis ensured that no member of the royal family would ever again be able to use their position to threaten or intimidate other family members. Most importantly, Princess Charlotte's innocent curiosity about her great-grandmother's thoughts had inadvertently created a test of character that revealed who could be trusted to uphold the values that the monarchy was supposed to represent. The question that Captain Wells had asked, whether Queen Camilla was certain she wanted to detain a child who carried the blood of kings, had exposed fundamental truths about power, responsibility, and the moral courage required to serve something greater than oneself. The crisis would be remembered as a turning point in the modern monarchy's development, a moment when the institution's commitment to its core principles was tested and, ultimately reaffirmed through the actions of those who chose duty over convenience, morality over expedience, and the protection of the innocent over the protection of the powerful. Queen Elizabeth's private papers would eventually be preserved according to proper archival standards, ensuring that future historians would have access to her honest assessments of her family and her institution, regardless of how uncomfortable those assessments might be for those who inherited her legacy. In the end, the morning's events had proven that the greatest threat to the monarchy came not from external enemies or public criticism, but from the willingness of those within the institution to abandon its core values in pursuit of protecting their personal interests. The question that saved Princess Charlotte had also saved the monarchy itself, reminding everyone involved that some principles are more important than power, and some truths are more valuable than the comfort that comes from keeping secrets.